Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Judy Gradwell. I'm President and CEO here at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and we are delighted to welcome you here for the State of Biodiversity. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I wanted to start by paying our respects to the indigenous peoples who are traditional stewards of the land. Kumeyaay people have lived in this region since time immemorial, and through colonization they were removed and their traditional knowledge was minimized. But Kumeyaay people have persisted, they remain part of this land and society today. The museum honors their continued legacy of understanding and protecting nature, and creating genuine and mutually beneficial relationships and partnerships is an ever-going process and one the museum is working on. Our museum has been dedicated to conservation since its inception in 1874. If anybody has enough fingers and is counting, it's 150 years this year. So we have been involved everything from preserving Torrey pines in Anza Borrego to pioneering work on the environmental effects of DDT. We strive to work in partnership with land agencies, other researchers, tribal representatives, and fellow nonprofits. It seems like environmental issues just grow larger every year, and it's only through partnerships that we're going to be able to be effective as a community and address all the challenges we face. And I know that many of you have been working on habitat assessment and conservation for decades, and I want to thank you and honor you for your service to nature in San Diego. Let's have a round of applause for that. We have a lot of exciting activities and plans for the museum's 150th, and this report that will result from this process is an important piece of our work toward improving life for people and wildlife in our region. The new nature trail gardens, if you walk past the construction fence outside, will open this summer and will feature pocket gardens and interpretive trails with native plants. We have a new paleontology facility that'll open in 2025 with visible collections and a fossil processing lab and a new gallery. And we're also part of the California Urban Nature Alliance, working with partners in San Francisco, Berkeley, Los Angeles to study, enhance, and preserve urban green spaces in our 3 large metro areas. And our part is working in local canyons. The Biodiversity Summit, which was held in February, brought together more than 250 conservationists, land managers, scientists, students, practitioners, and concerned public to discuss the challenges facing biodiversity in the region. We hosted the event with SANDAG, and it was facilitated by the Nonprofit Institute. Thank you to Keith Greer and Kim Smith. You want to wave your hands? At SANDAG, Tessa Tinkler, Darby Berry, and Abel Gong at the Nonprofit Institute for their work on the project. I'd also like to thank the Summit Steering Committee. Can you raise your hands if you were part of the planning? This is the group that put in a lot of time for this, so thank you. And then also, I'd love to just see who was here for the summit that this information is based on. Thank you for all of your work and for donating your thinking to the process. So tonight we're looking forward to sharing preliminary findings from the summit, and before we begin the program, I have the honor of doing all the safety announcements. Emergency exits are located behind you and behind me, and while we do ask that you silence your cell phones, we encourage you to continue tonight's conversation on social media using #NatTalk. For the program, this season of Nat Talks is made possible by presenting sponsor, the Downing Family Foundation, and media partner KPBS, the public media station serving San Diego and Imperial counties. Our first speaker is Phil Unitt, and he is the Dennis and Carol Wilson Endowed Chair of Ornithology and Curator of Department of Birds and Mammals. Phil is a specialist in subspecies identification, distribution, and history of distributional change in California birds. He authored, you did more than author. You conceived the notion of the California Bird Atlas, where this was the start of all of our atlas work, where Phil decided we should get people out seeing what lives where, and he not only set that up, but published it in the San Diego County Bird Atlas. He's been the editor of Western Birds for how many years, Phil? 30, more than 30. So a lot of service to nature and to the field as well. Phil has been at the Nat for almost 36 years and was born and raised in San Diego. And his family's been in this region since 1897. Today he's going to give us a brief environmental history of San Diego from a perspective that's shaped by his professional and his personal experiences and by stories and knowledge that has been passed on to him by his family. Thank you, and let's welcome Phil.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for coming this evening. There we are. Understanding the state of biodiversity in San Diego means understanding what we have, what we've lost, and what we've gained. So I think an overview of the history of environmental change in our region is worthwhile, an environmental history, if you will, integrating how human history is interlocked with the biological. Now I have only 20 minutes, so I'll touch on just a few key events that have had effects at the level of the ecosystem. It's audacious as me, as just an ornithologist, to attempt something so broad, but birds are the canaries in the coal mine, aren't they? So, where should we start? With the Pleistocene extinctions, which were just as profound in Southern California as anywhere in North America. Sea level rose considerably, and vegetation communities changed dramatically. Sea level didn't stabilize at its current level until about 3,100 years ago, reminding us how its apparent stability in historic time is ephemeral. Should we start with the arrival of Homo sapiens, or at least the arrival that led to permanent settlement? The archaeological record confirms continuous occupation of Southern California for at least 13,000 years. Like all human beings, Southern California's earliest residents exploited their environment. Fire was a tool they used regularly. Overexploitation happened prehistorically too. The flightless duck, Candites lawi, occurred on the Channel Islands, and its bones are known from several prehistoric middens along the mainland coast of Southern California. The process of extinction, however, took 8,000 years until the last duck was eaten about 2,500 years ago. Bones in archaeological sites attest that the short-tailed albatross was regular along the Southern California coast and especially numerous on San Nicolas Island, which could have supported a nesting colony. By the 1800s, the short-tailed albatross was nesting only on islands in the Western Pacific, where it was decimated by commercial exploitation and then volcanic eruption. But it's on the last 255 years since the Spanish colonization in 1769 that I'd like to focus. Even before Junipero Serra founded the mission, invasive weeds may have preceded him. Pollen of the red stem filary dating from the 1750s has been identified in ocean sediment off Santa Barbara. It must have spread north from central Baja with the help of native seed dispersers. By 1800, bits of vegetation in the bricks used to build the missions attested to at least 16 species of invasive weeds, including the black mustard. So San Diego's first contact with the United States came in 1800 with ships seeking illegal trade in sea otter skins. Soon, American and Russian traders were using Alaskan hunters to slaughter the sea otter on an industrial scale, and the Spanish authorities were powerless to stop them. Other pinnipeds, such as the elephant seal and Guadalupe fur seal, were wiped out too, and we have no way of knowing the status of any local marine mammal before the advent of commercial exploitation. All we can say is that the sea otter was the dominant marine mammal in San Diego's prehistoric archaeological sites. One of the first visits to San Diego to leave any trace in the scientific record was that of the French ship Le Héros with Captain Auguste Duosily and naturalist Paul-Émile Botta in 1827. Duosily extolled the fabulous abundance of the California quail, as well as its excellent flavor. He was astonished by the vast numbers of jackrabbits on Point Loma and described a communal hunt where the Kumeyaay people herded jackrabbits into a corner against a bluff and killed them with throwing sticks. Mexican independence in 1821 was followed in 1834 by the secularization of the missions and the conversion of their land into vast ranchos. This was the era of the hide and tallow trade, when dried cowhides were called California banknotes. Innumerable cattle roamed free of fences, accelerating erosion and carrying the seeds of invasive weeds wherever they could reach. Another profound environmental change preceded any scientific account. The American conquest of California in 1846 also brought army doctors and soldier naturalists. With them, the scientific description of San Diego's biodiversity finally began to get off the ground. Their collections led to description of species like the Pacific loon and Heermann's gull. And they revealed that the house mouse and roof rat were already present at San Diego, the first confirmation of invasive exotic animals. So, no sooner had the sea otter been exhausted than whaling took off. In the 1840s, it was said that great numbers of gray whales entered San Diego Bay to deliver their young, and rarely was there a day when scores of these mammals could not be seen spouting and basking in the warm sunlight. But already in 1843, an American ship was caught whaling in the bay illegally. After the conquest, whaling was unrestrained, and 2 rendering stations were established near the mouth of San Diego Bay. Their annual catch peaked at over 40 in the winter of 1871-72. Whaling ravaged the entire west coast of North America, subsiding only when petroleum products began replacing whale oil, and the whales themselves were decimated. The reign of the ranchos started to unravel in 1856, when 9 years of drought set in, relieved only by catastrophic flooding in 1862. Rancher Juan Forster testified that in 1864, Almost the whole country from north to south became almost depopulated of cattle from the fact that the country had been entirely overstocked about that time. Before the year 1864 had passed away, there was a perfect devastation. Imagine the environmental damage wrought by the ravenous herds as they died of thirst. A new era in San Diego began in 1867 with the arrival of Alonzo Horton, San Diego's first real estate promoter. The modern city began to take shape while the city fathers struggled to find a viable economic base. Those who could not grow or make an exportable product could speculate in real estate. So Horton began a tradition that continues to this day. Nevertheless, San Diego's trustees of 1868 made another decision more far-sighted than selling Horton 960 acres for $264. They set aside land for a city park, today's Balboa Park, our first designation of any park. In 1874, 5 guys got together and decided to form a San Diego Society of Natural History, the genesis of today's museum. They were San Diego's first full-time residents to devote themselves to recording biodiversity. For its first 25 years, City Park was neglected, but in 1892, the city leased Kate Sessions 30 acres for experimental nursery. The plants Kate Sessions propagated and promoted filled not only Balboa Park, but set the stage for landscaping region-wide. Kate Sessions may be called the mother not only of Balboa Park, but of San Diego landscaping. The very concept of landscaping represented a revolution in urbanization we now take for granted. The San Diego of unpaved streets and open ground began to be covered with vegetation. The concept that the urban environment should be planted where not paved has had profound effects by favoring organisms that can adapt to Kate Sessions' choices and disfavoring those that rely on bare dirt. The horned lark and pallid bat have retreated, while the introduction of fan palms allowed the yellow bat to colonize and the hooded oriole to proliferate. Meanwhile, out away from the city, the substitution of Anglo for Californio culture reverberated in the environment. Before the American conquest, hunting was not a focus of the rancheros' lives, despite the infamous bull and bear fights. Cattle killed by grizzly bears and mountain lions could hardly be that great a concern when the cattle themselves weren't even counted. But as Anglo ranchers took over, counting cows and pennies, predators were exterminated aggressively. In 1899, Henry Stewart and Walter Manriquez pursued San Diego County's last grizzly bear for 36 hours up San Mateo Canyon to Case Springs, where they finally shot it. Its skull is now in the Smithsonian. Another grizzly was killed in Trabuco Canyon in 1908, the last in the Peninsular Ranges. Now, it would be nice to be able to tell a tidy story of cascading ecological change due to the elimination or decimation of top-level predators. But other animals at all trophic levels were being picked off simultaneously. Waterfowl, especially geese, were hunted for the market on a massive scale. Hundreds per day were shot in the once vast delta of the Santa Ana River and sold in Los Angeles. San Diego County's last California condor was seen about 1910, last pronghorn in 1922, last long-eared kit fox in 1931. As the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era, the need for conservation became apparent. Under President Teddy Roosevelt, San Diego County's first forest reserves were decreed in 1907, then consolidated as the Cleveland National Forest the next year. One of the main concerns driving the establishment of the national forests was fire. In 1934, the Forest Service decreed that all fires should be suppressed by 10 a.m. The consequences of the policy of fire suppression compounded over the ensuing decades. 1907 also saw San Diego's first record of the Argentine ant, the household pest that has so thoroughly ousted native ants from urban areas. Inadvertent introduction of invertebrates has been a constant plague ever since. In 2016, one publication listed 1,686 species of exotic invertebrates as established in California. It reported that from 1990 to 2010, the rate of detection of new exotic invertebrate species was 10 per year. Native to North America, but absent from Southern California before the 1890s, was that parasitic bird, the brown-headed cowbird. In 1913, its population began to explode. Over the next few decades, populations of a long list of host species of birds that had been common collapsed. So the issue in the election for mayor of San Diego in 1917 was encapsulated in the slogan, "Smokestacks versus geraniums." Lewis Wilde promoted heavy industry, while George Marston extolled city planning and beautification as the keys to success. But San Diego ended up taking a third path, selling itself to the Navy. Probably the harbor made it inevitable. San Diego was designated headquarters for a naval district in 1922. Naval installations reshaped San Diego Bay. The 32nd Street Naval Base replaced a salt marsh. The development of North Island Naval Air Station entailed filling Spanish Bight and Whaler's Bight, where that rendering station was sketched. Museum director Clinton Abbott and Guy Fleming lobbied for the establishment of a state park in the Anza-Borrego Desert, which came to fruition in 1933. Cuyamaca Rancho and Palomar Mountain State Parks were also founded around that time, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the employment programs of the Great Depression, built their infrastructure. In the 1930s, the Western Salt Company expanded its operation in South San Diego Bay, installing many new dikes that eliminated more marsh, but also created new habitat for nesting waterbirds, allowing species like the Caspian tern, elegant tern, and black skimmer to spread. As World War II loomed, military preparation and industry ramped up. The military-industrial complex as the basis for San Diego's economy was set. Immigrants poured in by the hundreds of thousands, and the city spread out rapidly over the marine terraces. In 1942, the Marine Corps took over Rancho Santa Margarita y Las Flores, establishing Camp Pendleton and a buffer between San Diego and Los Angeles. The quest for water has always been the leading theme in San Diego's civic history. As more of the county's streams were dammed through the late 1800s and early 1900s, new reservoirs created new habitat. Freshwater fish were introduced, giving rise to a new food web. Fish-eating birds like the western grebe could colonize. Flooding was suppressed, giving riparian corridors an illusion of stability. In 1947, water from the Colorado River began arriving, and human population growth could burst its seams. Up until 1948, public transportation dominated San Diego. Then the colluding tire, gas, and auto companies bought up the streetcar lines and ripped out or paved over the rails. The city turned away from public transportation and toward the private automobile, driving urban sprawl further. Before World War II, Mission Bay was of interest primarily to duck hunters. But after the war, the concept of turning it into an aquatic park could be realized. From 1946 to 1962, 95% of the bay's tidal wetlands were eliminated. Finally, environmental concerns began to emerge in the social consciousness. In 1958, Ray Gilmore pioneered whale watching tours for the public following his research on the gray whale. In the 1960s, Joe Gill and his collaborators discovered the deleterious effects of DDT on bird eggs. The realization that the planet does not have an infinite capacity to absorb waste spawned a revolution in environmental attitudes, and in 1972, DDT was banned. Shooting of predators subsided, allowing some species to become urban adapters. Passage of the Federal Endangered Species Act authorized the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to designate organisms as endangered. By 1970, the California condor, bald eagle, Aleutian cackling goose, light-footed and Yuma's ridgeways rails, short-tailed albatross, peregrine falcon, brown pelican, and California least tern were all designated. In 1986, listing of the least Bill's vireo triggered intensive control of the brown-headed cowbird, and the positive effects of cowbird trapping extended to many other species of land birds, even though these have been poorly documented. Listing of the California gnatcatcher precipitated San Diego's multiple species conservation plan, an attempt to address conservation more comprehensively than the listing of single species enabled. The negotiations over the habitats and species to be covered entailed winners and losers. But the establishment of new reserves under this system was a huge step forward. San Diego's pattern of urbanization, often skipping over canyons and steep slopes, makes it a natural laboratory for the study of the effects of habitat fragmentation. Michael Soule, his collaborators and successors, took advantage of the opportunity with multiple pioneering studies of both birds and mammals beginning in 1988. At the museum, we hope to build on that legacy in a way that will stimulate conservation and restoration of these canyons. The arrival of the 21st century brought a turning point in our climate. Drought in 2002 was so severe that hardly any chaparral birds nested. The Pines Fire of 2002 was the second largest in San Diego history, until eclipsed the next year by the cedar and other fires that blew away all previous records. After the Witch Creek Fire of 2007, 25% of San Diego County, still undeveloped, had burned within 5 years. Surface living animals, like the brush rabbit, were decimated. But a wider suite of organisms than previously known were revealed as fire followers. Every kind of response imaginable was exemplified by some species or another. Succeeding years of drought stressed trees rendering them susceptible to death from insect pests like the invasive shot-hole borer and gold-spotted oak borer. These remind us that the influx of exotic organisms of all types is continuing unabated, if not accelerating. How to identify the ecosystem-level threats they may pose and how to prioritize effective management in response is a vexed question. Since 2014, tropicalization, a new word for me, has become evident in the distributions and numbers of fish, crabs, and seabirds of tropical affinities. Colonization of the brown booby on Los Coronados Islands in 2005 was followed by the yellow-crowned night heron at Imperial Beach in 2006. Both species are now well established. In 2018 and again in 2020, the ocean temperature at Scripps Pier hit an unprecedented 79.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The offshore kelp forest is threatened by intensifying heat. For 10 years, the number of days the ocean is cool enough to favor the growth of kelp has been minimal. In spite of the many losses in this history, there are gains to celebrate too. Gains that reflect human decisions should encourage us that it is possible to make a difference. Other gains remind us that evolution will yield some winners regardless of the plans we human beings make. So let's embrace our duty to plan for the future with both hope and humility, recognizing that decisions to favor one species or habitat over another can have unintended consequences. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil, and good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Thompson. I'm the Director of Conservation Biology here at the NAT. Thank you so much for being here. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speakers from the Nonprofit Institute. Back in fall of last year, when some of us at the NAT were getting together with some of us at SANDAG, thinking about the idea of bringing all of us together in some sort of convening event around our most urgent biodiversity conservation needs, it became immediately important that we need to partner with an organization that not only knew a lot of the organizations in the landscape, something about conservation, but also that had the ability to bring people together and draw out information in discussions and then synthesize the amazing amount of data that that produces into results. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's a pretty unique set of skills. We immediately thought of the Nonprofit Institute, and we've just really enjoyed working with them. Darby Berry, Tessa Tinkler, and Abel Gong, thank you so much, and your whole team for, it's just been a really enjoyable experience. And so today, Abel and Tessa will come up here and give us a sneak peek of the results from the February summit. So welcome.
Good evening. So, all right. So I just want to start by reiterating what Michelle shared, which is that this has really been a collaboration from the very start. NAT and SANDAG had a vision for what they wanted to do. The NAT was reflecting on its 150-year anniversary and thinking about the legacy of conservation and how can we mark this anniversary and think about the future. And so when they came to us back in October, wanting to collaborate and think about how we can better understand the needs and the strengths of the region to move forward, we were very enthusiastic to collaborate. So I want to start by just quickly telling you a little bit about the Nonprofit Institute and what we do. Our mission is to partner with and advocate for the nonprofit sector in San Diego. We have a belief that a strong nonprofit sector is a strong region. And so we do this. There's three primary areas of work that we do. We develop leaders, nonprofit leaders, but also other regional leaders in the community through different programs and trainings. We also have a lot of capacity building programs for nonprofits and also for networks and groups that come together. And then our third pillar is around research and creating and sharing knowledge that can really be applied to better our region. And so that's really where this work fits in. So I'm very enthusiastic to share some of the findings with you all. These are preliminary findings from the summit. But before I jump into that, I know there are some people in the audience that might not know a lot about this project and what we've done. So I want to tell you all a little bit. So just to lay out the purpose, the reason that we came together and did this work is to have a deeper understanding of biodiversity conservation needs, opportunities, strengths in the region. And the goal of doing this is to have some sort of document, report that can be used to inform future decisions, strategies, initiatives around biodiversity conservation. So far, this whole project, we have, as Judy mentioned, we have a steering committee that has been guiding this process. It's made up of 12 professionals that are many of whom are in this room, so thank you all. They've been along to help us think through how we wanted to do the convening, and they're continuing to be involved in the analysis of the findings as well. So we designed and facilitated this, what here we're calling a stakeholder workshop, but it was the Biodiversity Conservation Summit that we had in February with many 200 plus attendees. And we had this convening in order to collect data about the assets, gaps, and needs in the region. From there, we have arrived today to be able to share the preliminary findings with you all. And then our next step is we will be developing a draft report in May of 2024. And once we have that draft, we're actually going to open it up for public feedback and comment. So you all should be looking for that in May. Might be end of May, but in May. And then we will produce a final report in the summer of 2024. And you know, it's an important component that from the beginning, this has been something that we are trying to learn from you all and from this community. And so it's really important to us that you do give us your comment and feedback. So before we share some of the findings, I'm just going to quickly go through a little bit of our methodology. So how did we collect this data? We started with a pre-survey of biodiversity conservation professionals in the community. And just so you all know, you're great survey takers. We had like a great turnout. We do a lot of surveying at the Nonprofit Institute, and I can tell you it's difficult to get responses. It is not difficult with this audience. It's incredible. So we had 119 respondents that gave us information to just help inform the type of information that we wanted to gather in the summit. And then for the actual summit, it was a full day workshop. It was a lot of fun for those of you all that were here, and we had interactive breakout sessions across topical areas. And then we also collected a lot of data throughout the day. If you weren't here, you can imagine a lot of sticky notes, Post-its, flip chart paper, just a lot of different opportunities for people to give input and feedback. And then we've also been reviewing relevant academic and applied literature along the way. So we've done the preliminary analysis, which is what we're going to share. Most of the data is textual and qualitative in nature, so we've done some thematic qualitative analysis. And throughout this process, we've continued to bring it back and get input from the NAT and from SANDAG staff, as well as with the steering committee, just to continue to feed in and make sure that what we're seeing we understand and makes a cohesive story. So out of all of that, we have identified 4 primary themes that really seem to cross all of the topical areas. And the first theme that we have seen is around connectivity, and that's connectivity of habitats, ecosystems, but then also systems and structures. The second primary theme is collaboration. So a need for collaboration across groups, organizations, and people. The third theme is thinking about and better understanding the enduring climate impacts and on biodiversity in the region. And then the final theme is how, it really connects to the talk that Phil just gave. How will our community and how can our community respond to change? Change being something that we can see from that talk is, both the most predictable and unpredictable nature of being on this planet. And so with these 4 themes, we have a lot of interesting data that we've found. And so I'm going to invite Abel Gom to come up, and they're going to walk us through what we found so far.
All right, who's ready to get into this data? I am, for sure. Woo. All right, so I'll be introducing each of these themes with a definition to sort of ground you and what kind of lens we're coming from, and then we'll go into a few slides about results for each of these themes. So starting first with connectivity, we defined connectivity as the strengthening of community connections to place across diverse and divergent ecosystems and habitat scales, as well as a deeper integration across systems of practice, including policy and program alignment. At our summit, we identified a few ecosystem priorities. This included wildlife corridors and crossings between habitat islands across different habitat types. Think maybe a wildlife crossing over a highway or riparian crossings, things like that. Connecting urban spaces to open space, especially through canyons. I think San Diego has this really unique opportunity where sometimes nature is in our backyard. I live and I work by the University of San Diego, and we have a canyon right next to us, which is really awesome. So that's a very opportune space for connecting ourselves to nature. Finally, this idea of boundary spanning invasive species management. That is, how do we standardize management for a particular invasive species across multiple habitats or locations? So how does this management span geography? Also, in terms of connectivity, we think about the people and how can we increase people's connection to nature, both emotionally and physically. So at our summit, we identified a need for increased education and outreach around biodiversity and inclusive engagement. We also identified promoting holistic efforts to increase biodiversity and help the public and policymakers understand ecosystem benefits and how they tie to economic resilience. That being, what kind of economic benefits do our biodiversity efforts have for us? And then finally, physically connecting people to nature. How do we equitably access nature? How do communities equitably access nature and conserve lands? Finally, in the connectivity section, we identified some system and structure gaps and opportunities. In order to make natural spaces accessible in both physical space and in time availability, there needs to be a dedicated funding opportunity for staff to steward the land. And so if we want to get people connected to the land, who's taking care of that land? Who's managing that land? We need to fund that. Additionally, better regional data sharing is needed. Shared databases and systems, standardizing data and protocol across borders, especially as it comes to binational data. And then these standardized databases will inform managers for better monitoring and managing. Moving on to our collaboration bucket. Again, this is the people piece and working together. So we defined collaboration as fostering opportunities for collaboration and community across diverse sectors and scales. So this can be government, academia, tribes, etc., from the individual scale to the community scale and beyond, as well as facilitating stronger linkages for the broader community of practice to accelerate agents of action and enabling collaborative leadership. And so when we're thinking about collaboration, we first wanted to identify who needed to strengthen collaborations. And I want to preface this by saying I'm going to present a very simple looking map here of who needs to strengthen their relationships, but these relationships take a lot of time. This is a very pressing issue of biodiversity conservation, but building trust and building relationships takes a lot of time and takes a lot of intention. So this map is a lot more simplified than what is reality. Firstly, what was identified was tribes, US agencies, and Mexico agencies need to strengthen their relationships, as well as community-based organizations to actually all of these agencies above. Additionally, schools and youth-serving community-based organizations focused on increasing access to nature from a young age would benefit greatly from working together. Looking into the research, scientists and community and marketing experts could work together to make biodiversity conservation more accessible to the public. And taking that message to non-traditional messengers such as businesses, for-profit organizations, religious institutions, people you would consider non-traditional to conservation. Working together would spread the word even more. And then finally, bringing policy into this. City and county planners, policymakers, and scientists need to strengthen their relationships. Moving on from the who is sort of the what portion. So what do these people need to do to help further biodiversity and conservation in our region? Firstly, expanding knowledge sharing, such as cross-pollination of knowledge across different systems, especially with indigenous communities, is absolutely necessary. Expanding cross-border biodiversity studies and community-informed research, and involving scientists and their science and policy writing is also necessary. And finally, public outreach with communication professionals and system-wide collaboration across the region focused on youth fostering a connection to place, that being like the outdoors or nature, starting at a young age, would strengthen their connection, but also prepare our future for what's to come. So we've sort of listed all of these really big concepts. We sort of identified how we could get to those concepts. These are really good starts. And so we have reducing barriers to collaboration was a necessity. This can include things like providing more cross-border convenings across different communities, including travel stipends and funding this sort of collaboration, as well as providing translation services at these sorts of convenings as well. making research accessible and understandable to a wide audience, not only in language, so between like Spanish and English, but also in jargon, so distilling that information down and making it widely accessible to the public, including making information open access. And finally, initiating community-informed research. That is, communities who experience greater environmental burdens should be involved in research agendas and policy making. So now we have the connection, we have the collaboration. How does this all interact in terms of climate change? That's what this section will be all about. So we define this climate section as understanding the impacts of a changing climate temporally and spatially across the bioregion, as well as advancing adaptation and practice and evolving knowledge, systems, and communication in response to a changing climate. And so at our Biodiversity Summit back in February, we had all of these really interactive activities. And one of the questions that we asked our experts and our practitioners was, how urgently are you concerned with a particular threat as it relates to biodiversity conservation? And we presented them 5 different threats: wildfire, drought, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and sea level rise. And they were to place a time-scaled urgency upon them. And these were the results. So this is the only graph you'll see, no more numbers after this. But you'll see that this is ordered from, I guess, what you can classify as most urgent to non-urgent. The color red, or the leftmost bar, is that these experts are concerned with this particular threat in the next 5 years. Orange, or the middle bar, is post-2030. And then yellow, or the rightmost bar, is 2040 and beyond. So you can see wildfire is deemed as most urgent, then drought, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and then sea level rise. One thing that was of note to me that I found really interesting was this mixed result of concern around extreme precipitation and sea level rise. And I found this really interesting because even though there was sort of, people weren't really sure about the urgency, there was also this really big knowledge gap in our other questions, that people actually didn't know a whole lot about how sea level rise and extreme precipitation, other threats that kind of come with a need for coastal resilience and coastal issues. They don't really know how species or habitats are impacted by that. And so perhaps this lack of urgency or sort of less urgent mannerism is more of a, I don't really know, this is a knowledge gap. So I found that really interesting. So also within the climate sphere, we found several species and habitat gaps in knowledge. And so the first is this sort of idea of baseline data, so abundance data, genetic data, natural history even. It's needed for native species and sensitive species, as well as modeling for where these species will move in the face of climate change. Kind of along that same vein, across all of the habitat types that we surveyed in our summit, understanding population monitoring and especially population migration around range shifts and whether these species would need assistance with their migration was also a key gap, especially as it relates to climate change. And then concerns around invasive species management and eradication and how these species may interact with native species as the climate changes was another key knowledge gap that we had in relation to climate. As it relates to the community, there's a lot of misinformation going around the internet, going around everywhere about climate change. And so to combat this misinformation, many suggested education, outreach, and community engagement to get the community involved and knowledgeable about climate change and its impacts to their communities. However, it came with a caveat. These education, outreach, and engagement opportunities must be culturally relevant, and they need to, and we as the people engaging in the community need to listen and actively communicate with historically excluded groups and meet communities where they're at, especially Indigenous groups. Additionally, looking into conservation research funding through the lens of climate change actually opens up a whole avenue of funding through climate funds. And so unsiloing conservation and kind of approaching it from this holistic lens brings in a lot of opportunity to fund your research and also consider another perspective of biodiversity conservation. Finally, we have our change section, and so this sort of tackles emerging innovation, new structures, things like that. We define this as uplifting holistic future-forward opportunities across the community of practice to meet evolving needs and changing demands, as well as creating an enabling environment to support emerging practices in land management, data acquisition, and ecosystem services. So one way we can look at change is through funding. Understanding the full costs and the full holistic costs of biodiversity conservation, I use costs in sort of two different ways. One being the actual cost to do projects and the cost avoided as a result of those projects, as well as the cost beyond our monetary value, so think like cultural or social costs, is really important when we're thinking about biodiversity conservation. So how will this affect our communities in different ways beyond just the dollar value? Additionally, enhancing the implementation of equity in the process to accessing funding and allocation of where those funds are spent. So how are people learning about these funding opportunities? How are they accessing the funding? And how are these resources being distributed? Needs to be revisited. And then finally, thinking about the pathways and identifying those pathways for less restrictive and more flexible funding for projects and programs, and creating the opportunity for these projects and programs to be responsive and proactive rather than reactive. Responsive and proactive rather than reactive and delayed is really important. So this being making sure that as data emerges that we are able to adapt to the current needs as the data comes out and not just looking at the needs that were pressing when the funding was first proposed. Oops. Okay. I'll leave that up there for a second for you to digest that. Okay. Also thinking about change, we looked at governance and management and identified some key opportunities. So first is enhancing the adoption of emerging and innovative land management and conservation practices, such as co-stewardship models, land trusts, land back programs with Indigenous partners, and flexible conservation easements. Supporting the policy and program development that centers Indigenous and cultural knowledge, as well as incorporating the human benefits of a healthy ecosystem and studying them, and including this research and policy. So think about the different ecosystem benefits that we have. How do we apply that to our policy and really sort of highlight the multiple benefits that biodiversity and conservation have for not just the animals themselves, but for our communities. Finally, from the change lens, we looked at opportunities in public awareness and leadership. So we identified a few different opportunities here. The first being developing a more robust workforce development pathway that focuses on diversifying skill sets and career definitions with an emphasis on reducing the barriers to entry. increasing avenues for knowledge sharing and knowledge activation. So think things like community science programs, museum programs maybe even. And finally, increasing the use of and validity of innovative communication platforms such as social media and storytelling. There were a lot of people who identified Instagram and TikTok as really great ways to get the message across about conservation, and I find that really great. And I also really am glad to see storytelling as such a big opportunity for telling the story of biodiversity and the great rich history that it holds here in San Diego. So finally, as we think about how we can use all of these results to tell the story of biodiversity conservation, we kind of wanted to land on some sort of central theme. So we asked our practitioners and experts why biodiversity was important to them. And so these were the results. The bigger words are mean that more people answered with that answer. The smaller ones are less people who answered, but still just as valuable. As we can see, biodiversity is integral to many beyond just the natural beauty of nature. It is integral for our survival, our sustainability, and our resilience for life. And it is our legacy and our culture. So as you reflect upon the results today and listen to the upcoming speakers, I hope that you take this word cloud in mind, and I hope you see yourself in it as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Tessa and Neville. Now I'd like to invite our 4 panelists up to the stage. And I'd also like to introduce our speaker, our panel moderator, Paula Sternberg, who is our Science Communications Manager here at the NET.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Michelle. We have a really wonderful panel ready for you today, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Empress Holiday, who is the Coastal Training Program Associate and Research Assistant at the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve, or Turner. A hand for Empress, please. Thank you. We also have Crystal Benham, Chief of Resource Management for the County of San Diego Parks and Recreation. We have Horacio de la Cueva, Research Scientist at Centro de Investigación Científica y Educación Superior de Ensenada, CICESE. And last but definitely not least is Michael Connolly Misquish, Resource Economist and Kumeyaay Historian with Southern California Chairman's Association. So for this panel, I'll be asking a series of questions to our panelists to answer one by one, and then I will go ahead and welcome some questions from the public if time permits. Question number 1. Within your community and/or your line of work, what are some of the most important gaps or barriers related to biodiversity conservation that you'd like to see addressed? So I'll start with Empress, and we can go down the line.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paula. I'd say that, the reserve is located in Imperial Beach, California. So working in the border region has a very interesting set of challenges. But in terms of barriers to biodiversity conservation, something that we certainly have issues with is access. And then there's access and obviously equitable access, but access in general can be pretty difficult for certain parts of our reserve. And when we talk about why access is such an issue, the majority of the southern portion of our reserve is cut off due to terrible, terrible seasonal flooding that we get that essentially cuts off the single road that allows folks physical access to the southern portion of our reserve, including Borderfield State Park. And that site is especially important for a number of folks within our community. The Kumeyaay especially value that space as well. So just physically not being able to get there means a lot. But you also can think that access is an issue with biodiversity conservation because we foster the relationship with the outdoors by being in the outdoors. And the value that we ascribe to these places, this repeat experience to learn what biodiversity actually even is pretty important. And we try to meet folks where they are, right? So access is one thing, equitable access is another thing. There are folks that will never ever set foot at our reserve or even in San Diego, right? So how do we still invite folks there to teach, to get them to value biodiversity conservation, even if they can't be there? So we try to do that with accessible materials virtually, by limiting cost when and where possible, or eliminating cost where possible as well. That also has to do with, I'm hearing a lot about social media, which is awesome. And I don't TikTok, but I know that Instagram is very, very popular, but so are podcasts. So we've really tapped into that with a podcast based at our reserve called Divided Together. And we've seen that be pretty successful as well. So access is a huge barrier for us.
So I would say access too as well, actually. But in addition to physical access, which I think is really important, for us, I think it's also access to the materials, because a lot of what we do is very technical, and we use a certain kind of jargon and information that's really not accessible to everybody and doesn't make sense to everybody necessarily. And that's one of the things we've been working on with our website, is just changing the language to make it simplified and make it make sense to everybody. And then also translating that information into different languages so it's accessible to people, not only English speakers, but others. And then the other piece too with accessibility is our data. So we tend to take our data and information and put it in to reports, which are very nice, and we put them on our websites, but then they just kind of sit there in a way. I don't think that they're really accessible to everybody because of their length and, again, the technical content as well. So I think really focusing on making sure the information is out there and digestible to people so that they understand the importance of biodiversity, what it means in our region, and then can really connect to it. And I agree with physical access as well.
Being in a research institution, our gaps are mostly the gaps with the other gaps in knowledge. And we, just as Phil pointed out, how many new invasive species have been described in the last years of invertebrates? And what are those changes going to be? We might be calling them invasive species, but these might be species that are colonizing because the climate is changing. So there's these gaps. And I'm afraid of other gaps. It's not the things we don't know, it's those things or those things that are going to come to be that we are not even expecting. With this climate change, there's going to be surprises. There's going to be new things happening, and we don't know those, and we have to be ready to understand why they're happening. And then there's the barriers, and one of the things which were mentioned part of the results, this is how do we share data? The thing is, I think one of the reasons why I'm here is because it's to show that we share environments and we share species and we share a lot of things, and that there's a barrier in between, that there's a border and there's visa restrictions and travel problems doesn't mean that the problems are different between here and Baja California. And then if we don't look for a regional solution, a bioregional solution, we're not going to overcome those. So those are those barriers are real.
Thank you. I'm going to go a little bit more on the philosophical side. One of the issues that I see the most when I get involved in restoration and habitat conservation is just the acknowledgement of really the depth of what has occurred before. When we look at the incredible biodiversity of the San Diego region, we're looking at an ecosystem that has had human accompaniment, human intervention, human activity that has occurred hand in hand with this ecosystem for thousands of years. And a good part of that biodiversity is no doubt linked to the types of activities that have occurred, whether it's from the burning activity, whether it was from wetlands enhancement, through rock drop structures and raising the groundwater table, whether it was to the way the plants were harvested and how new plants were placed into other areas. And what I always seek to do whenever I'm involved in restoration is to go in and see how can we make humans a keystone species in this ecosystem again. Why do we have to take people out of the equation when people are part of it? They're part of what created this ecosystem to start with. A lot of the cascade effects that happen in the ecosystem were not just from the elimination of the grizzly bear or the pronghorn antelope, but also from the removal of people from that traditional setting and that traditional interaction that they had with the ecosystem. And that's one of the key areas that I like to focus on, and one of the shortcomings that I see in a lot of the activities that occur. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's really wonderful seeing how each individual background informs different answers. So, the second question for tonight is, the report results highlight collaboration as being key to address big challenges in conservation. What are some of the most important avenues of collaboration that you're exploring or that you would be interested in exploring? And I'll let whoever would like to answer first.
Okay. Well, since almost all the time I've been working in the area, one of the things that we've noticed is where maps stop. A few years ago, I was at a waterfowl group, and the maps stopped at the US border in Mexico and Canada. Like if birds didn't overwinter in Mexico, reproduced in Canada. So they magically appear so people can shoot them. No. So again, here we are in a bioregion, and what I think we have to do is create a set of data that is useful for us, that we can share across. So it's we scientists, researchers, and all the community, communities that want to see their problems solved have to sit together and design those data so that they help us solve our questions, our problems, and give us the solutions we need to have a sustainable life.
The Kumeyaay community is very diverse. We have 12 reservations in the United States and 4 indigenous ejidos in northern Baja. And we have communities that are working, all throughout our region in a lot of different ways to try to recreate and bring back some of the traditional practices, but not just within our own culture, but also for the non-Kumeyaay population too, the ways that we can share, that we can find tools and perhaps alternative ways to explore the different issues and address them. We have started an Associative Arts degree at Cuyamaca College in Kumeyaay Studies that has an ethnoecology and an ethnobotany component to it. We're looking at having a bachelor's degree started at San Diego State in the same topics. We're doing stuff with food sovereignty with UCSD. And we're working with a lot of nonprofits. I'm working on a project in some of the canyons down in Tijuana on doing restoration work that involves traditional or the traditional plantings in some of the canyons there. Also working with some people that are looking at the new park designation for Los Choyas and ways that we can try to incorporate some of that in there. Worked with the Wild Animal Park or Safari Park, as it's known now, and worked with the Museum of Us. So there's a lot of institutions that that I've worked with and that I know other people in my community have also worked with to establish these types of collaborations and ways that we can bring things forward. And it's an incredibly open period in our history when people are willing to actually listen to us on a lot of these issues. And I think it's part of the magnitude of some of the problems that we face that people realize that you can't always have business as usual, that you need to look for other ways to go forward, and that not everything that's been done in the past can continue into the future. And so there is that opening. Don't expect them to adopt everything that we say, but certainly I think there are some contributions that can be made.
So from my perspective, I think one of the big things for collaboration is some of what we already do through SANDAG and San Diego Management and Monitoring programs. So our county and city multiple species conservation programs had an assumption that we would have a regional funding source. You know, and the idea behind that is that we would work together, collect data, share data, and that regional funding source hasn't quite worked out the way we thought it would originally, and we really need to continue that work, and SANDAG has really been spearheading that, getting us all together and continuing to collaborate with San Diego Management and Monitoring Program. But you know, I have a concern that if that were to go away without a regional funding source, the collaboration could really stall in a way. So I really see the value of that and making sure we're continuing to work together.
You know, this one kind of stumps me because I don't know how to fit it all in such a short time, because collaboration is all that we do. And we're very, very, very fortunate as a National Estuarine Research Reserve to have many partners and on many, many different scales that are extremely supportive of the very place-based efforts that we have as a research reserve representing a bioregion. But that does not mean just the United States. We have someone on our team whose job is specifically to work in Mexico and to foster those relationships, and she's fantastic at it. But so many partners that we have are just amazing at really, really leaning on us, but also allowing us to lean on them to yield where we don't know what we don't know. And so most recently that has come about with developing what's known as a binational emergency response guide. So through the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, their marine debris program, if anyone is familiar, they have started creating marine debris response guides for states. Many states in the Gulf Coast deal with derelict fishing gear as a means of marine debris, and it's very, very concerning, obviously, for biodiversity, and obviously we know what debris issues do. But here at our reserve, marine debris manifests itself not through fishing gear that comes up from the ocean, but much of it comes from river and canyons, right? A lot of tributary canyons that feed their way into the reserve, but also from various sources here in San Diego. And so what happens is when it rains, you know, we know how rain is here, right? It can be quite flashy. We get a lot in a short window, and we get terrible catastrophic flooding at times in the river valley, quite flat. And what happens is especially what happened in January, with all that water we got we did not expect. We see lives threatened, we see homes threatened, not just here, but in those canyons in Mexico as well. How do we respond to that? At what point in the United States is it a concern for us with what's happening in Mexico, right? Having those conversations and getting a number of different agencies together in one room was a very big challenge, and it's something that we're working on. This guide does not exist anywhere. This guide is something that we're really trying to nail down to get agencies to say, at this point, our agency can respond and support Mexico or different agencies in the US in this way. And getting to each agency to do that, when I say agencies, we're working with agencies like San Diego Fire Rescue, Border Patrol, the International Boundary and Water Commission, California Office of Emergency Services, California State Water Boards. So these are not just communities on the local level, right? It's both that, but it's also these larger scales. So something that we do very well at the reserve is facilitating those relationships, but really, you know, putting them in a room and saying, talk to each other, right? So I think we do pretty well with that, but collaboration is all we do, and we can't do anything that we do without it, so.
All right, thank you. One of the themes that came out of this report as well is the need for education materials that are relevant to specific cultures, communities, and lines of work. What are some of the culturally relevant education, outreach, and engagement needs for the line of work and communities that you are a part of? Should I call on someone?
I can go. So from the county's perspective, I think that we engage with certain groups that are used to working with the government and feel comfortable working with us, but that's not everybody. And so we really need help engaging with people, especially people that haven't engaged with us in the past and maybe for various reasons don't feel comfortable doing so. And we do that a lot with community-based organizations. So partnering with community-based organizations so that we can work through them to work with all different types of populations. And I think it's really important for us to make sure we're not just talking to the same groups and really getting the word out for biodiversity and making sure we're connecting with people in a way that they feel comfortable and that the information's accessible.
We live in our traditional territory. There's over 5 million people, and there are around 5,000 people that identify themselves as Kumeyaay or Kumeyaay descendants. So there's no way that we can go and really get out to everybody and see them. There are some people with some expertise that, you know, they could spend every day going from one group to another, going from one school to another. I feel bad sometimes. I get texts or emails from people asking me, if I could talk to their class, or they're going on a tour. I just got a text from a guy who has a junior high school class that he's taken to Mission Trails, and he was wondering if I could stop in and give a few words. And it's, you can imagine that there's so much that, we have done a lot on YouTube. We're working on creating manuals and different types of monographs on different activities. We have people in our community who are very actively involved in food sovereignty and working with other communities to bring some of that knowledge forward. We know that we can't go to everybody and teach everybody just from our perspective. So there are other people that we also need to teach. We need to teach the teachers and then have that carry forward too. So that's also a big part of what we do within the community to try to broaden that understanding or that base of knowledge that we can contribute and carry forward.
I write science papers and I write for a newspaper, and when I thought about this question, it wasn't so much of how do we communicate, but more important, what do we have to communicate? If our challenge is biodiversity in the region, how do we make that a part of everybody's language every day? And I think the challenge is not how, but what we have, what we want people to know, what we want to know better, so that we can deal better with the changes that are coming, and how do we deal with the biodiversity?
This especially interests me as a former educator with California State Parks at the reserve. When we talk about accessibility, it's also in terms of like how we're teaching these things, specifically biodiversity, right? When we have groups that come to the reserve if there are any educators anywhere in here, you understand that you have attention for so long, right? And you lose them. And so you have this finite amount of time to capture their attention, but to also do that very well and effectively so that they take something home. They're not going to take everything, but you want them to take something. And so we do that with making sure that materials, you know, I heard earlier someone say jargon is a huge problem at a research reserve. Is the same, you know, so we have to figure out how we talk about, you know, like water quality data and things like this, depending on whatever grade level we get. We get kindergartners, you know, we get postgrads, and how do we talk about these issues with them? But making sure that materials are in various different languages, and in our community, a lot of that looks like Spanish and English. But also making sure that it's not just a language thing, right? It's not just a physical access thing as well, but there are other ways to transfer and gain knowledge, right? And we really, I'm seeing a lot of those trends in education a lot more, utilizing various different senses. There are many folks with disabilities that come to the reserve, and we have a docent, a longtime docent named Ron, who is blind, and he and his guide dog Gidget know the trails at the reserve by heart because he walks them every day. And she just knows the way. It's beautiful. And they actually lead nature walks on the weekends. But the way he leads the walk is not visually. He has them touch things. He has them listen to the dry bladder pod. He has them feel the white sage. He has them smell the black sage, you know, or it's just the most incredible thing. And folks take so much more out of that. And we've started to see various different groups come and request this one specific nature walk. And, you know, we can't have groups of 100 people, you know, out on these trails. And so just like the fact that he's in such high demand goes to show that there's something outside of this traditional, you know, way that we tend to think about education. So when I hear culturally relevant, I think what are other ways that we can get knowledge to folks regardless of background and things like that.
All right, so we have one last question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to the public. What's something that you all would like to see in your lifetime in regards to successful biodiversity conservation? It's a loaded question, so.
One of the things that has always troubled me, and it still goes on to this day, and it was mentioned, I think, in one part of the discussion of the report, was the siloing of authorities and information, and it's just amazing that, you know, our water laws are so bizarre in California. A whole different set of laws covers a stream when it's on the surface, and then when it goes underground, then a whole another set of laws comes into place. How much you can draw. If you go to the rural parts of San Diego County, you can put a well in the ground and you can pump as long as you want. You could farm rice if that's what you want, and just long as till your groundwater gives out. And if you do decimate your neighbors, then they have to go through 20 or 30 years of litigation to get a groundwater adjudication to guarantee they have some of the water in that area. The county, when they have a development that goes in a groundwater area, they'll do an assessment on the sustainability of the groundwater, but it's an assessment of the sustainability for human use. There's no look at how will a sustained depletion of this water resource over time going to affect the oak trees or the chaparral, and, you know, what's going to happen to the riparian areas if this occurs over a long period of time. The Regional Water Quality Control Board looks at surface water quality on streams, and we've been working with them recently to try to help enact a baseline standard that all waters within the region should be treated as if humans are going to be coming in contact with it or going to ingest some of it, because people use the water courses all over the place. For a lot of different things, not just harvesting traditional plants, but medicines and crafts products and things like that. So there needs there needs to be more of a comprehensive across-the-board approach. When the Southern Multiple Species Conservation Plan was put in place, there were comments about why there wasn't any collaboration with the tribes when they developed it, and their response was, well, this doesn't apply to tribes. It only applies to the off-reservation land. But, you know, the species don't know that. And so they're going back and forth, and, you know, and how is that going to impact the people in the adjacent jurisdictions, and what can the tribes then be, what can they do and be a part of that? And and maybe they have a stake also in that long-term management. So there's so much siloing that's going on. There's these little power structures throughout the system, and I think that it makes it difficult then to have any kind of comprehensive approach.
So mine's very specific, but it's a certain wildlife corridor in the South County area that I would really like to see conserved. It's part of our plan. We've been working on it for a long time, but I think, you know, now more than ever with climate change, the focus on wildlife corridors and making sure that certain areas don't get cut off so species can move as they need, especially as climate change is more and more important. And so it's something that I have on my mind a lot, and we acquire land, especially in this area, for the wildlife corridor. So something I'm really hoping to see happen.
I want to piggyback off of something that you said earlier, Michael, which was why are people removed from the conversation when we talk about biodiversity? And that's so critical to think about, because solutions work best when nature wins and when people win, and finding where those win-wins are is pretty important. We are the last intact coastal wetland in Southern California. And we were designated as a wildlife refuge and a national estuary and research reserve because of our biodiversity, because of the endangered species that depend on our site. But that matters nothing if the folks that utilize these sites or manage these sites don't understand the value of that, right? You have to get people to care. So what I would like to see with biodiversity conservation is a more holistic approach, to be more intrinsic and secondhand. You know, I would like it to not be this far-off conversation or afterthought, you know, about like, oh, well, we should also think about the human dimension of this. It should be part of the conversation to begin with. There are so many, everything that we look at now, there's no place on this earth that is untouched, you know, by the impact of humans. So that conversation can't necessarily, it doesn't even work anymore, to just think about, you know, this nature space separate from humans within it. So I just wanted to piggyback on that. That's something I would like to see.
I was going to think what type of future you want, and I think I want a more porous future. We're talking about how we're dividing ourselves in silos, how we're getting into silos, and how we're isolating the way we look at things. So I think we have to start breaking those silos and go across them. And on the nature aspect, the United States built this wall. And that has had incredible implications for nature, for flow of water, for species movement. A couple of people from here were expert witnesses at some federal cases. And the National Institute of Ecology in Mexico wrote a whole book about what the impacts of this barrier, this real barrier is. I was also thinking that my wife is from Tijuana, and her grandparents, if they wanted to go to somewhere in San Diego, said, oh, I live 3 blocks down, I'm going there and coming back. So the border was more porous. And it was because there was this trust. And I'm not saying that we should open up the border for everybody, but this may, and at the same time, maybe we should. if you've been traveling back and forth between Tijuana and San Diego in the last 5 years, it used to take 15 minutes to cross the border in your car back. Now it can take you to go back to Tijuana up to 3 or 4 hours stuck in traffic. And that means a lot of air pollution, and it means a lot of hours wasted and a lot of other things. So we really have to think how we make this border area better for everybody. We're not doing anything. If we don't keep it porous, it's going to be harder for us to live here.
Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful answers. We're going to go ahead and open it up to the public. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll try my best to repeat it for everyone else, and then we'll direct it to our panelists. No questions? Okay, so over here. Yes, back there.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you all so much for sharing all your knowledge. It's been really a privilege to be here and listen to y'all, speak to your expertises. I am somebody that is just starting out in this field, and I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about how you got started in this field, and also if you have any advice / resources for somebody like me.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. We started off with a thank you to all the panelists, and then as someone that is starting out in that field, do you have any advice, and then also share a little bit about how you got started and what you do today? So Michael, we can start with you and then go down the line.
I followed a very convoluted path. So I don't recommend it for you. I was an aerospace engineer, and I went to work for my tribe. They were starting an environmental office, and I said, well, I'll step away from aerospace for a couple of years and get you guys going. And so I became the first director of the Campo EPA. And after a couple of years, then I was ready. I was ready to move on, and I thought about going back to aerospace, and it certainly paid much more than the environmental field. I'll tell you that. But I was really starting to just enjoy it so much. Just getting into the nitty-gritty of the science behind a lot of the traditional ecological knowledge and how it was applied and how it could be resurrected and be utilized in the present day, and history, and a lot of the historical research that I was starting to do, and I thought, maybe there's something for me here, and so I really used my engineering background, shifted more toward environmental engineering, and started working as a consultant, and was able to just have a fantastic career working for tribes all over the United States. Worked in the North Slope of Alaska, been on different towns on the Yukon River, just all over, and it's been to me it's a very rewarding type of field to be involved in and see the results of what you've done. In Mexico, some of our communities there had just their wetlands had been decimated by years of cattle grazing, and we brought some of their own traditional techniques into stream restoration, and I think I hit the pause button there. And they were able to resurrect their basket making, the cottage industry, so you go to a lot of the powwows and stuff down in San Diego, and you'll see these groups from Mexico that come up with very, very beautiful juncus baskets and willow baskets and stuff that has become a huge source of income to them now from that restoration that occurred, and their wetlands are healthy, and they're it's just really great. On my own reservation, a lot of that too. So it's I just segued into it kind of sideways and just started studying and learning whatever I could, and working with different agencies and writing, and speaking at conferences and getting asked the hard questions, and which is always good. Teaching classes and getting asked the hard questions from the students, and all of that was how I ended up going into the field. So I'm sorry if I can't give you an easy path to follow, but I think there are multiple paths that, and I've met many people in the restoration field that have worked in radically different fields before, and then they feel that calling of the land, the love of the land, and the love of nature that they want to be a part of, and so I don't think you really have to have a very rigid path to go there. I think you can come from many different directions.
Well, not quite the engineering, but I did my doctoral work on flight mechanics, animal flight mechanics. So yeah, so you can come from very different backgrounds. And when I moved from Canada to Ensenada, we were very interested in migratory birds on western sandpipers, and what's going to happen to these birds that have to migrate from the North Slope to Washington. They stop in Washington, they stop here in Baja California, they go to Panama, Chile. And what's going to happen if wetlands disappear? How many wetlands can disappear before the species disappears and doesn't have a place to stop over and feed? So that's where I started, and from there it became, we wanted to reintroduce the California condor to Baja California, so I worked on that. And now I work with the vaquita, which is also another, only depressing stories. But I have always, in a way, followed my nose. I think this is an interesting problem. This is a problem I can contribute to the solution, or to understand better the problem. And I think that's what you have to follow. What you know what to do, what you're willing to learn, and how you can help solve a problem that way.
So I got into the field, I always wanted to be in conservation planning. I studied that in school, but I happened to graduate in 2008 when the economy was not very good. And at the time, the best job I could find was a consulting job in water resources planning. And to be honest, I was totally freaked out by it because I had no idea what to do with water resources planning. But I thought, hey, I'll give it a try. And, so that's one piece of advice, is just maybe, trust yourself. You can do things even if maybe you don't think you're equipped for it. Because I did learn on that job, and I met a lot of great people at the county as my clients at the time, which is how I ended up moving to the county and eventually getting into, kind of a dream job situation. So, the path's not always easy, but, I'd say just trust yourself and you'll find your way there. But then also more specifically, the county does have a lot of entry-level type of job opportunities. So if you are interested, I can meet you afterwards and give you my card. I'd be happy to chat with you.
Talk about networking. Yeah.
I can't offer you a job, but I can say that I was very fortunate to know what I wanted to do since I was a kid. I always got very itchy if I didn't spend time outside. And my mom thought that was very odd. I wanted to be outside in the dirt with my brothers. I wanted to be outside all the time. And I knew growing up that I could not do without that. And I remember I was very young. I didn't know what I was looking at. I remember driving up the highway with my dad. I've lived in San Diego my whole life. And I saw this large pipe sticking out on a beach, and I was like, what are they, they're sucking up the ocean, what are they doing, It was beach nourishment, I didn't know what I was looking at. But I remember my dad, he was like, I don't know. He knew, he was like, I don't know, you should look into it, and he's like, and if it makes you angry, and if it makes you curious, chase that. And I have done that ever since, I remember feeling angry and just, why, I need to know. And that just naturally led itself to where I am. When I got to college, I got my associate's, bachelor's, and master's in geography, which is probably why I choose to look at everything at a very high level approach. I cannot focus on just the one thing without considering other things, because there's no two things in this world that are not related to each other. That's the one rule we have in geography, is that everything is related, but things that are closer are more related, right? And so I naturally have to think big, right? I need to think big, and then I can get small. And I graduated in 2020. Who was hiring? Nobody. So sometimes you have to wait. You might not have to wait long, but sometimes you have to wait, you know, and you have to dig a little. It just so happened to be that I wrote my master's thesis on environmental justice in Imperial Beach regarding young people in outdoor spaces, and I interviewed my now boss for my master's. 2021 comes around, people are starting to go outside, right? It's a little bit okay to go outside again. The reserve is hiring, and I applied, and here I am, you know, stuck now. And I couldn't see myself anywhere else getting to ask the questions that I do. It's very hard to search geographer jobs if you're not doing geographic information systems, you know. And I was like, I need a job where I can be outside, but not all the time because it gets hot. I need to be, I need to work from home, but I do also want to go into an office, you know, and I kind of found the sweet spot, and it's perfect. And we go to TJ for tacos, you know, like it's just kind of nice. So yeah, I would say chase what really, really calls to you, right? And you'll never go wrong with that. It might not like pay the best, but you won't go wrong. You'll be happy. You'll be happy.
Thank you for those insightful answers. It's wonderful learning a little bit more of your background. So we have time for one more question, and we can start right here. Yes.
Hi. Hello, my name is Brian. And so my question was for Empress specifically. You mentioned working with Border Patrol as one of the organizations, and so I was curious how you navigate those type of relationships when an organization like Border Patrol can represent something oppressive for certain communities, and how you go about that.
Absolutely. I'm going to repeat the question really quick. So Brian mentioned that Empress talked about working with Border Patrol, and he's curious about how you might be able to work with these organizations when they might represent something like oppression to other groups.
You're absolutely correct. And a lot of what we do has to be in this, you know, like I said, we work in this like perfect in-between space, which is great for me, but that also means toggling, you know, being objective and providing resources needed for the community, regardless of my passions or the way that I feel. But I also use it, I don't want to say like use it against them, but I also say like, what information can I get from our partners, and also how can I maybe use it to benefit them, to show them that there are good things too. And so in terms of working with Border Patrol, in this sense, a lot of that is saying, okay, if you are so focused on this border region, and if oftentimes, you know, your agency is known for, you know, these very negative connotations and things like that, what good can you do instead? You know, what good can you provide? And in this case, that's asking, what good can you provide to communities in Mexico, right? And so a lot of that I found to be very surprised at that meeting, pleasantly surprised, and it was great. It was very constructive in terms of them even offering to facilitate conversations even further. And so I often find that if I just ask, you know, or if I think about how I can use certain, because it's not just, you know, Border Patrol, it's also a lot of different organizations that kind of, in this border region, you know, there's a lot of negative stigma, there's a lot of attention that we get for some very bad reasons, but there are good things that happen too. So trying to elevate that to show it's not just that, but also if there are these bad things that are happening, can we have good things happening too, maybe from the same organization? So again, with them participating in the Binational Emergency Response Guide, that's kind of what I'm getting at with that, right? If, again, just trying to kind of balance the scales a little bit. We cannot control their operations in terms of, you know, homeland security and things like that. But I can ask them, okay, can you support biodiversity? Can you support flooding of communities in the United States? And, with marine debris that exacerbates these issues exponentially. So kind of maybe coming at it in ways that I have control over. But it does get difficult. It does get very, very difficult. I do appreciate that question, actually, yeah.
All right, thank you. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you all so much for your contributions to today's event. I'd like to welcome Kim Smith, the Senior Regional Planner at the San Diego Association of Governments, and Michelle Thompson, Director of Conservation Biology here at the NAT. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. We'll let the panel step down. That's okay. So are you guys ready? It's getting kind of late. Are you guys ready to wrap it up? Michelle and I are here to give some closing remarks and a little bit of inspiration and some next steps. So I just want to give a giant thank you to our panelists. That was so informative, and I learned so much. And also to our other presenters, NPI, and also Phil. I feel like all of our speakers here have been so cohesive, and it's really been very informative and eye-opening, so I'm glad to see that a lot of you are still here. Just this picture above, you've kind of heard weave throughout all of our presentation tonight. San Diego is really a special place. It is a global biodiversity hotspot. See if I can do this. Also, it has more endangered species than any other county in the continental U.S. And so how, moving forward, are we going to protect this special place? Our efforts in conservation, as we heard, started 30 plus years ago and were led by many of you in this room. So kudos to everybody who have been working on conservation throughout time. With the establishment of our region's first habitat conservation plans. And so in order to continue these efforts, we need all of your help, and beyond just us here tonight, we need help from other conservation stakeholders, other communities, the public. So tonight is just one step forward to protect this region's unique biodiversity for future generations. SANDAG, we're very excited about our partnership with the San Diego Natural History Museum, with NPI, and with all of you guys here tonight to determine what those gaps, those priorities, needs, and opportunities are to move conservation forward. So just quickly to kind of talk about where we've been, and I believe Tessa kind of covered where we've been. So, our timeline back in September, we started this effort, we brought the NAT and NPI on, we engaged our steering committee, planned our workshop, we held the Biodiversity Conservation Summit in February, got all of this great input, which leads us to tonight, the symposium, where we got to hear these preliminary results. And so just to remind you, where we're headed is in May, we hope to be releasing the draft report for a public review period, and that's going to be coordinated with the NAT. And then from May through July, we'll be working to incorporate the feedback that we receive, both with the NAT, NPI, and our steering committee, culminating in a final state of biodiversity report in early August. So more to come on that, and now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Kim. So even though we're calling it a final report, we know it's not final, right? We can't stop there. It has to keep going. And also, there's been decades of work building up to this point, all these convenings, and we still have a lot of work in front of us. And it can't be just us. It can't be just Kim, SANDAG, NPI, and the NAT working together. We really need all of your support moving forward. And there are multiple steps, and we can't achieve this alone. So I want to end with a little bit of a reflection on what one of the speakers said at the summit in February. And so if you weren't there, or if you just need a little refresher, Brian O'Donnell is the director of Campaign for Nature, and he joined us at the February summit to give an inspirational talk at lunch. And he was actually on his way to somewhere like halfway across the world. I think it was Africa, directly after that talk. So while he was giving the talk, he snapped a photo of all of us in the audience, and he said, I'm going to take this with me on my trip because I'm going to a similar event in Africa. It's a convening for conservation. And he said, I'm going to take it, it's going to provide motivation, and just to let people know what people are doing here in San Diego. And he reminded us really that we're all connected, right? Ecosystems are connected across the world, including humans. And the convening event in Africa really depends on us here in San Diego to succeed in our events, just as we depend on the conservation convening events in Africa to succeed. And just as I think some of our panelists mentioned, you know, San Diego depends on Baja California to succeed, and Baja California depends on San Diego to succeed in our conservation efforts. And just as all of you here in the room, look to your right, look to your left, we all depend on each other to reach a common goal for thriving biodiversity in this region, for both communities and wildlife, and a region that can really collaborate and cohesively face conservation challenges efficiently and effectively. So I really want to thank everyone for getting us to this stage in the process and for continuing to move us forward to not only reach our goals, but also improve our goals to have the most biodiverse region here and conserve it in San Diego. So thank you so much. That concludes our session this evening, if it wasn't obvious. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. We hope to see you back soon.